Welcome back to the channel. I just wanted to make a quick video attempting to answer what is probably the most commonly asked question that I see relating to the lore of Twilight Imperium. Now, you clicked on the video, you saw the title, so you know that we're going to be talking about the time scale of the game. I see this question asked all the time on Reddit, in the Discord, all over the place. Just exactly how long is a round in Twilight Imperium, or how long is the Twilight Imperium game? What's the time scale that we're playing over? When I first started playing TI, I was under the impression that it would be thousands of years, because you start with just one little system, just a couple of ships, and you build out. It seems like you're building a grand civilization. You're advancing technologically, you're having great councils and determining policy that will last for generations. It seemed like just a huge timescale, an expansive timescale. I have since come around to a much condensed version of that, because I started to dive into the lore, and in the lore you kind of see it's different than you would expect. It takes less of a expansive, millennia-long timescale, and it does more of a Star Wars with it, in that, I mean, if you know anything about Star Wars lore, you know that the Empire from like Rise to Fall, I think it lasts something like 19 years. It's not a long time, and yet it's a galactic empire. So that's kind of what TI feels like once you start to dive into the actual lore of the game. So let's go over that lore, and I will give some support, and I will give you my final take on exactly what a round looks like, what the Galactic Council looks like, all of that stuff. So, let's get into it. The first thing that we need to address is the fact that faster than light travel, it's ubiquitous throughout the galaxy. In the Empyrean lore, we learn that faster than light travel, pretty much every race in the galaxy has access to it. The Empyrean were probably the first ones to have it, but we know that every race throughout the galaxy can travel faster than light. Not only that, but we know that this faster than light travel uses hyperspace bubbles. This is found in the first edition expansion Borderlands. There's mention of hyperspace bubbles. So we can kind of assume that ships can travel at Star Wars speeds, meaning they can cross the galaxy in mere months. It's not going to take them long at all, which does jive with a much smaller time frame for how long the game is played, because it doesn't take decades upon millennia it doesn't take thousands of years to cross the galaxy. That's what I'm saying. So, we have speeds down, we don't need to worry about distances, we can cross the galaxy very quickly. Second, we know that from the Quan incident until the fall of Mechatol, so an entire interstellar war between the Lazaks, the Federation of Sol, Universities of Jolnar, and Barony of Letnev. So, a massive conflict that just wrecked house throughout the galaxy. That only lasted 73 years. So a century was enough time for a galactic war to break out and the Lazaks Empire to fall. And then, within 18 years of the bombing of Mechatol, the Lazaks were believed to be extinct. So we know that events in galaxy, monumental, cataclysmic events, they don't take nearly as long as you would expect. I don't have it written down. Oh, no, I do. Okay, the Twilight Wars, they last only around 300 years, and they absolutely ravaged the galaxy. I'm talking just devastation, civilizational collapse. I mean, all of these great races, which were galaxy-spanning empires in and of themselves, they were all reduced to a couple of planets. It's mind-boggling how much the Twilight Wars regressed the galaxy, and it only took 300 years. Which, yes, granted, that's a long time, but it's nothing if you think about it in a interstellar galactic civilization timescale. I mean, the Lazaks Empire itself lasted for 30,000 years, and within 300 years, all of that progress was undone. So we know that monumental events, they happen pretty much in an instant in the Twilight Imperium universe. We can make a couple of assumptions as well. We know that the game is set within a single lifespan, a single human lifespan, in fact, thanks to the Federation of Soul, because the leaders are available all game. They don't die out of old age or anything. And yes, you could make the argument that these leaders, they are placeholders for just concepts within the civilization, but I don't think that that makes much sense. They have personalities, they've got flavor text that is spread out throughout all the action cards. I think that the game does take place within a single lifespan. This is an assumption I'm making, but I think it's a solid assumption. So, single lifespan, 80 years, let's say. So you've got 80 years from start to finish of the game. I think that is the high end of how long a game of Twilight Imperium lasts. Now, more importantly than that, in, I think it was 2nd edition lore? It might be 1st edition, because I think it's Borderlands, so I actually think it is 1st edition. I'll just put it on the screen. So, in some lore tidbit, where we have the Battle of Imilpar, which I did a video on, go check that out, we know that the space battle over Imilpar, it took almost no time at all. In fact, the quote is maybe an hour, and then the L1 were already landing on the planet before it could even react. So, space combat and invasion, they're both very, very fast. Now, this doesn't mean ground combat is fast, but it does mean that the combat we are playing out in-game, it takes place over a day or two at the most. Now, ground combat, if you've ever tried to invade a planet, I would assume you probably haven't, but, you know, I think you can imagine trying to invade a planet. It would probably take a really, really long time. The Mindnet, in the invasion of Imilpar, they sent over 100 landing craft to the surface, containing over 6 divisions. So Sol only had a standard 2 divisions. Now, I don't know what a division in the Twilight Imperium universe looks like. However, a division in real life is 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers, depending on a variety of factors. Now, these 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers, Sol's got 2 divisions, 30,000 soldiers, divided up between 5 major planetary centers. I mean, we're not looking at monumentally huge forces here. I mean, I think something like 1 million soldiers died at the Battle of the Somme in World War I. So we're not looking at anything crazy. We're looking at a holding force, practically, which jives with how the game is played. I mean, if you view influence sort of as a population metric of a planet, it's not as though you fight and take a planet and its influence is reduced to 0. You're just killing the holding force and putting your own in place, which, that makes sense. You know, it makes more sense than waging a generations-long conflict on a planet. If you think of trying to conquer Earth, there's no way even an overwhelming force is going to be able to crush all resistance on our planet. It's just not going to happen. A planetary scale is so mind-bogglingly huge that it's unrealistic to assume that you could ever conquer it. And this is borne out in lore. I mean, the Yssaril constantly are a thorn in the side of the conquering Lazaks, even though the Lazaks own that planet. So, assuming that there's a holding force for the power that is nominally in control of that planet, that makes sense to me. And it also allows for a much shorter time frame on ground combat, because all that has to happen is the 2 holding forces have to battle it out and see which one wins. That makes sense. It's less of a commitment. It also doesn't destroy the population of the major powers. I mean, if there's I don't have any numbers on the top of my head, but there's billions of Sardak, but if those billions of Sardak are busy conquering all of the planets and dying out, it's not going to be very easy for the Sardak to maintain its position of dominance. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking small holding forces are being sent, and that is borne out in the Battle for Imilpar lore. Now, let's get back to time frame. We can stop talking about how combat works. We do know from the Shards of the Throne lore that the men from the scout unit H-256, which is a Federation of Sol task force, they were deployed for 5 months when they discovered the necrovirus on the third moon of Kalhadar. So a deployment lasted 5 months. And that heavy fighting had been taking place on the central and coreward fronts for weeks. So the war with the L1, which is what this lore is describing, had only been taking place for weeks when the necrovirus was discovered. And yet, in those weeks, we have the L1Z1X Mindnet conquering Tiamat, Herculor, Emilpar, countless other unnamed systems, including the Hakan homeworld. From this, we can infer that massive military campaigns, they really only take 6 months, a year, maybe 2 at the most, to go from start to finish. And huge swaths of territory can be captured in that amount of time. So we've got a much smaller time frame than we originally started with, which would have been generational warfare over vast distances. We know that ships are fast, we know that combat is fast, and we even have in-lore examples of massive military campaigns just happening in mere weeks. So based off of all of that, I would say that each round of the game is roughly 1 year. And you have to remember, we're talking about a sci-fi setting, so what exactly is a year? I would say it is roughly equivalent to 1 Earth year. There we go. So around 1 Earth year, or something similar. I'm sure that a Mechatol year is not that far off. But we've got that, and then I would say that each tactical action you're taking, so each action you get to take, that's roughly a month or so, simply because, you know, you go and you take a planet, and you move all of the ships in, you conquer the planet, you subjugate the citizens. That probably takes about a month, I would say. And I would say most of the time, these things are happening relatively in parallel, in a way that the game can't really show, just because there has to be a turn order. But that's my take. And then I would say that the agenda phase, which, you know, it's the Galactic Council, I'd say that that's running in parallel within legislation going into effect at the end of each year. You have to remember, they're only passing 2 laws a year. It's not as if the Galactic Council is super fast or anything. 2 laws in 1 year for a galaxy. So I'd say that makes sense as well, based off of the hand-wavy unrealism of sci-fi. Because, you know, in reality, none of this makes any sense, and none of this would work in real life. But in the sci-fi universe, we can say agenda phase runs in parallel, and at the end of each year, the legislation goes into effect, and a round is roughly 1 year. Now, there are some flaws in this. As I mentioned before, the gameplay really more simulates the building of a grand interstellar empire. So the factions are expanding throughout an entire galaxy. Personally, I think that the timescale should be more grand, but I think it's probably more likely that this just gets chalked up to the oversimplification that has to happen in game mechanics. I mean, you're playing a simplified space opera. You're not watching empires rise and fall over the course of generations. You're rather playing a Star Wars game or a Star Trek game. You're seeing grand events happen in the course of one person's lifetime, so you can get connected to the characters and the setting. That's my personal belief. But if you wanted it to make more sense, I think that honestly, the game as it is portrayed has to take place over thousands of years. But that's just me. And then there's also some lore passages that contradict this time scale. At least they lightly contradict it. For instance, there is on the extra faction sheet a quote that says, "Less than a decade after the occupation of Archon Tau, the Letnev fleet suffered a stunning defeat against Sol in the Grawl system. And then only a few cycles after the battle, the Sol Phoenix fleet entered the Xlax system and engaged the heavily fortified Letnev positions on Archon Tau." So far so good. Everything is on the up and up with the timescale we've established. It takes a couple of decades of fighting, and then the Letnev fleet gets basically destroyed over Grawl, and then almost immediately after that, I think a cycle is supposed to be a couple of days, like a planetary cycle. That makes sense to me. It might be a month, but I think it's a couple of days. After a few cycles after the battle, the Sol fleet shows up in the extra system looking to conquer it, but then the ensuing bombardments and battles lasted for almost 2 years. 2 years is quite a bit longer than I expected space battle and ground battle to go. That said, I think it still fits within the time frame, especially because you have to remember this could be multiple sides taking the planet back and forth, and also this is not holding forces. They actually just obliterate the planet's atmosphere. So I think that it's probably more the exception to the rule, and most of the time space battles and land battles, they aren't nearly as cataclysmic as the battle for Archon Tau. Now, this video has already gone rather longer than I expected it to, but I think this is a pretty solid way of viewing the in-game mechanics. If you disagree, I'd love to hear it down in the comments. I don't think that it is by any means the only way that you can view this. In fact, I personally am more partial to a longer time scale. However, I just don't think that the lore supports it. But this is all opinion, and it was just a fun video to make, and I hope that you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!